Hey everyone, welcome. Is this on?
I think it was when I come.
Can you all hear me?
You had to get a little closer, maybe? Is it
It's not doing anything.
It's on. I mean,
It's on?
that's on.
That's on, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear it, but I think it's back.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if the mic is working. No? Susan?
Sound like the mic.
Yeah.
We'll put the-
There you go.
Look at all. You can hear me, probably. The on-off button is a very important part of our technology. Welcome, everyone, to the Lemon Project Symposium and to our special session this afternoon, which is entitled African American Churches, Cemeteries, and Documentary Records of Black Virginians. My name is Hannah Rosen, and I'm a faculty member here at William and Mary, and I am delighted to welcome our 4 guest speakers this afternoon, each of whom will be offering insights on various venues and methods through which Black history is being preserved, discovered, interpreted, and shared in Virginia. My plan is to introduce our 4 guests now, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And that way we do not have to interrupt the conversation for more introductions later. And then once each presenter is finished, we should have time for discussion, comments, suggestions, ideas from all of you. So I very much look forward to that as well. I should say that 2 of our panelists are on Zoom today. Oh, the screen isn't on. One more thing to turn on. Sorry, I have to mute it and then I can. There we go. Okay, so 2 of our presenters are on Zoom. I don't know what they can see. Can you see the room or do you just see me standing at the podium?
Hello? See you at the podium.
All right, it would be nice if you could see the audience, but is that more than we can do
You
right
don't
now?
have a camera.
We don't have a camera. I apologize, but we'll make sure you hear questions from the audience, okay? So first, I would like to welcome R.G.A. Ferguson III, who goes by Trey, to our panel. Mr. Ferguson received a BA from the University of Miami in Communications and Theater Arts and a Master's of Divinity from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. He's currently minister at the Refuge Church in Homestead, Florida, and also a writer and co-host of the podcast, 3 Black Men, Theology, Culture, and the World Around Us. He's also a scholar of Black church history, and his presentation today is entitled The Black Church, America's Oldest Negro Academy. Speaking second today is another panelist whom I would like to welcome, Christopher Hunter. Dr. Hunter received a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Cincinnati and a Master of Science and a Ph.D. in Architecture from Texas A&M University. He's an assistant professor of architecture at Mississippi State University and a specialist in the architectural history of Black churches. His presentation today is entitled The Architecture of the African American Church House, 1800 to the 1920s. I'm also delighted to welcome our 3rd panelist who is here in the room, Tim Case, who is pursuing his PhD in history at William and Mary. Mr. Case received his BA in Cultural Studies from the Honors College of Florida Atlantic University and has 2 master's degrees in history, because one wasn't enough, one from San Jose State University and one from William and Mary. Mr. Case has also taught high school history for many years and served as principal. Sam, am I remembering? He was vice principal of a high school. That is noble work. His research is focused on Civil War memory and the memory of emancipation in the post-war South, and he's especially interested in the role of cemeteries in that history. His presentation is entitled Rest Assured, Space, Memory, Resistance, and Reclamation in John Mitchell Jr.'s Woodland Cemetery. And finally, last but not at all least, I welcome Lydia Neuroth to the session. Ms. Neuroth earned a BA in history from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Science in Library Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's currently the project manager for Virginia Untold at the Library of Virginia. Over her career, she's developed special expertise in public history interpretation of historic sites and has focused on those sites' histories of slavery. Her presentation is titled, Reaching Beyond the Conventional with Virginia Untold. Okay, now we would like to invite Mr. Ferguson to take the screen, not the floor, and please join me everyone in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be with you all this afternoon. I have the coveted after lunch snack, so I'm here to battle what we in my community refer to as the itis. But I ain't new to this, I'm true to this, so we're gonna get this thing cracking if that's all right with you guys. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared up here. And hopefully this does the trick. Give me a moment here. All right, can we see that? Is everybody on the same page here?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So for the next few moments, trying to be respectful of everybody's time here, I wanted to speak with you all about the Black church, what I refer to as America's oldest Negro academy. And really what I mean when I say that is that the Black church plays a central role in the formation and the preservation of African-American culture throughout the history of the colonies and what eventually becomes the United States of America. Now, when I use that term, the oldest academy, I'm not referring to the academy in the sense of formal higher education, what I hope is obviously, but when I talk about academy, we're talking about a society or institution of distinguished scholars and artists or scientists that aim to promote and maintain standards in its particular field, right? So much in the way that we are currently sitting in the College of William and Mary, an institution of higher learning that represents a part of the academy, but we have different academies throughout a society, right? Like the Oscars are hosted by an academy dedicated to preserving and honoring motion pictures. We have the Academy of Sound that issues Grammy Awards. There are different academies dedicated to preserving certain aspects of our culture. And what I believe is that the Black church is critical to understanding the history of African Americans here in these United States. And in order to understand that, we have to go back to the beginning of an African presence on the shores of what are now these United States, which we now commonly trace back to the year 1619, where there's this systemic erasure of African culture. It's an intentional thing that happens, right? In our contemporary society, there's a lot of alarm justifiably raised about policies that separate families, particularly when it relates to social services within the United States or border control at the southern border. When we separate families, we recognize that as something traumatic, right? The family being the locus of where you are affirmed in your identity, where you receive your heritage. And that's something that happens intentionally, strategically, and repeatedly with the first Africans who were brought to the shores of the Americas. And we have this trauma of separation that occurs. And also there's this conversion from communities of people who were brought over in bondage into capital, where they're now traded. They're not affirmed or honored for the very different communities and areas that they're coming from in life. Instead, they are property. They are plugged into machines that are used for capital. And some of that capital becomes instrumental in shaping institutions that we would commonly recognize as the academy. Pictured here on this slide, we have what was founded as New College and then quickly recognized as Harvard University, the oldest university, the oldest college in the United States of America, was founded in 1636. And sorry, I have a date wrong right there in the slide. The College of William and Mary is the second oldest university in the United States, not 1639, but 1693. I have those numbers inverted. I apologize for that. But one of the interesting things here, as I am speaking about this as a practicing clergy person, both of these colleges were founded for the express purpose of training the clergy. Right? Harvard was founded to train clergy. That's what it is there for. And then the charter of the College of William and Mary, which was issued on February 8th of 1693 by King William III and Queen Mary II. We have the College of William and Mary, which was founded to make, found, and establish a certain place of universal study, a perpetual college of divinity, philosophy, languages, and the good arts and sciences. But right there, what we have is this idea that an institution of higher learning ought to be able to train the clergy, ought to be able to train people in matters of divinity, because this common separation of those, this bifurcation that we take for granted nowadays with those things, is a relatively recent invention, right? Like the idea that the higher learning and divinity are two separate institutions and two separate fields of study, it wasn't always taken for granted to the degree that it is today. And both of these institutions of higher learning, the two oldest in this nation's history, were founded with the express purpose of training clergy people. Because at the center of our history is this notion of the church. But the problem with that is that from this nation's inception, Black people have been shut out from the academy in very obvious ways. And so the question becomes, what institutions, what academies do we have to promote and or maintain African American culture? And I don't necessarily mean this in the formal sense at every step of the way, because a lot of this, because of the way that cultures work, happens in an informal setting. In Africa, there is, in many African societies or cultures rather, there's this concept of the griot, these people who are trusted with the stories, the legacies of the people. A lot of that is passed down orally. It is understood from community to community. But as there's this systemic stripping and erasure of culture, the question becomes, who becomes the griot, the stewards of this legacy, of this history of a people? Some of that happens outside of the formal structures of the church as it begins to take shape over the 17th and 18th centuries on the shores of America. But as things begin to take on a more formal shape and there is this rise of the Black church becomes a de facto steward of these stories and of these legacies. And we see that in the rise of indigenous art forms and expressions. It's argued by some people that the Negro spirituals are America's first indigenous art form, the first thing that is exported from the United States, the first art that is exported from the United States, with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and a lot of what we now recognize as American popular music has roots in soul, R&B that is going back to the plantations of the American South. And so we have things like the spirituals, the ring shouts, a lot of what is now recognized as Pentecostal and spiritual expressions in the American evangelical church can be traced back to the African people who would eventually take on some form of Christianity. And that doesn't stop with just the art forms that we now recognize. We have Black readers of renown, whether we're talking about Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or Bishop Henry McNeill Turner or Ida B. Wells Barnett, who all find their start and can trace their start to the Black church, with some of the country's oldest Black denominations like the African Methodist Episcopal or AME Church or the AME Zion Church, to which Frederick Douglass was a licensed minister. We have the Black church playing a very central role in this struggle for Black identity and Black freedom, what it means to be Black, as these people are eventually known, these descendants of these formerly enslaved Africans, what it means to be Black in America. The church is at the center of shaping and preserving what that journey looks like. So much so that when it comes to the scholarship of one Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, he views the church as a primary source for the study of Black Americans and his study the souls of Black folk. A lot of what he does is go around and track Black churches around the country, their expressions, the history that is preserved, the church rolls over the centuries. The Black church is at the center of studying this culture, throughout the first couple of centuries of American history, to the point that the advent of the civil rights movement, the Black church serves as a base of sorts. We have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which many people will be familiar with, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is based out of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, after being at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, from which the Montgomery Improvement Association launches the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks, which many people consider the launch of that civil rights movement. The Black church serves as a home base because throughout its history, so many of the spokespeople, whether right or wrongly attributed that role, have been found in the Black church. Some of the first Black elected officials in this nation's history, leading up to and in the wake of Reconstruction, were ministers from the Black church. And when it comes to the civil rights era, a lot of these people come from the Black church as a de facto spokespeople, being this academy that shapes the identity and the belonging of Black people. Now, it's important to recognize that this is not a glorification of the Black church in that sense. It's a recognition of what the Black church has meant, because the Black church has not always been perfect in this regard. In fact, in some senses, the Black church has served as a foil to Black power. So we start seeing some of these tensions bubble to the surface during the civil rights movement, where leaders like Stokely Carmichael, or eventually known as Kwame Ture, who led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, would have some disagreements over how civil rights ought to be attained with the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Some people started to see the Black church as protectors of respectability. And there's this quote that says, you can't defeat the master using the master's tools. There's this distrust that is in part justifiable of the Black church, saying how can we achieve civil rights using the same religion and the same language as the people who authored our bondage. And so the Black church begins to see some of its esteem and if not esteem, some of its relevancy questioned and pushed to the margins in the story of Black people and the struggle for the rights and advancement and liberation of Black people, as questions arise as to the best way of doing this. Now, if we're talking about the Black church as an academy, it's important to recognize that that's not a question that is unique to the Black church. Even the academy, as we would think of it in a higher learning sense, there are questions as to whether or not this is still serving us as a people. As the cost of higher education goes up and the opportunities that are afforded to people with degrees and people who belong to these institutions seem to be dwindling, question then becomes, is this still serving us well? Is this the best way to do this? Is there another way of achieving progress? Is there another way to steward our identity in this season? And so the same questions that face the institutions of higher learning that we would commonly recognize as the academy are facing the Black church in our day and age. Questions that are exacerbated by the reality that the world that we live in is quite different than the world of 1619. As a matter of fact, I like to draw this comparison a lot of times that Christianity as we know it would not have taken the shape that we now recognize had it not been for the printing press in the 16th century, which largely aided the Protestant Reformation as we know it. Nowadays, we have the smartphone and modern technology, which is spurred on the speed that we access information, new ideas, that we contact people outside of our own bubbles and spheres of influence. And so the question becomes, is there any relevance for the Black church when there are so many different people who claim to have knowledge of the culture and the history and the stories of Black people? And with this new world of technology so readily available to so many people, we have people like Mark Zuckerberg, who made dropping out of the academy cool. The value that we place on institutions has drastically changed as the power of gatekeeping has shifted. with all of these technological advances. And the fact of the matter is academies, they cost too much in the literal sense. But when we talk about the Black church, the question is, what is the cost that we pay to participate in this institution? What do we have to sacrifice? What of our own motives and everything do we have to put by the side in order to follow the ethos of the Black church? And the flip side of this is that nuns, people who are not identifying with any particular religious explanation, are the fastest growing demographic in America. So as the value that we've placed on institutions has changed, the value that we place in religion itself has changed. And the question confronting the Black church is, what do we have to offer the world moving forward? We can't long for time past when things were different and we were the primary or a primary source of Black culture and legacy. The fact of the matter is that it is either adjust or be left behind in a permanent basis. And with that said, I think I have about 30 seconds left. I don't have anything else to say. Thank you so much for your time. I'd love to connect with you all if you have any questions, but we will pass this off to our next presenter.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the little delay there. My name is Chris Hunter. I'm glad to be here with you guys, and we'll just dive right in here. This is an introduction to early African-American church buildings that were constructed between 1800 and the 1920s. Okay. In the documentation of African-American history, and specifically African-American church history, two things have generally been documented, as a matter of fact, well documented over the course of American history. And that has been the people and the events. The images that you're seeing here to the left is Dr. King speaking in a church during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And the image to the right is an image of the bombing that occurred in September of 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church, in which 4 children were killed and 17 to 20 others were injured. My research focus is on the intersection between architecture and American history, as you see in the concentric circles here. As we get tighter and tighter from architectural history and African-American history down to sacred architecture, the institution of the Black church, and where we overlap with the context of and the presence of the African-American church building. In my research, I focus on 3 aspects of this architecture: the study of church buildings, which continue to function as houses of worship today, churches located on historically Black colleges and university campuses, HBCUs, as well as church buildings which no longer exist. So how did we get here? Similar to some of the things that Ms. Ferguson said a little bit earlier, I'll be referencing back to Dr. Du Bois myself. The Negro Church is the only social institution of the Negroes which started in the African forest and survived slavery. This was one of many things that came out of the Third Atlanta Conference of focusing on Negro problems in the year 1898. In 1903, Dr. Du Bois published a book called The Negro Church, and he concluded that over the course of 400 years, specifically focusing on the transatlantic slave trade, Africans brought their religious beliefs and practices to the Western world. The practice of African religion, according to Du Bois, has its origins in nature worship, meaning that in Western African cultures, a constructed building was not necessary for the worship of, for spirituality and the exercise of worship. This map illustrates some that many of you already know about the flow of the transatlantic slave trade. As Africans were imported over hundreds of years to the Western Hemisphere, less than 500,000 actually made it to North America, specifically America. But within the body of our country, there was an internal domestic slave trade that occurred during the years you see noted here. So-called points of entry here from Norfolk to Charleston to Savannah to Mobile, New Orleans, and Galveston, Texas, were all points where slavers arrived, brought in cargo, and then moved that cargo, that human cargo, throughout the southeast portion of our country. Motivated by survival, Africans which were brought to America found ways to blend or syncretize their religious beliefs with Christianity. Simply put, these were husbands and wives and mothers and fathers and children and people. They represented different types of cultures throughout West Africa, and that culture survived with them as they made it over to this country and were exposed to Christianity. So within the context of primarily attempting to survive, American-born slaves exercised acts of defiance with regards with the focus on preaching of white Southern ministers. The enslaved developed their own understanding of Christianity, which dramatically differed from the slave owners and their chosen preachers. The enslaved community had developed an extensive religion life of their own, hidden from the eyes of the master. Enslaved persons devised several techniques to avoid detection of their meetings. One of those practices was to meet in secluded places, woods, gullies, ravines, and thickets. They were called hush harbors. This is where people would truly steal away from bondage into wooded areas here where they felt free enough to worship, express themselves from their own spiritual perspective instead of being either monitored or controlled by a master or one of the master's preachers. But by the eve of the American Civil War, the majority of enslaved persons were American-born, and the culture and linguistic barriers which had impeded the evangelization of earlier generations of African-born people was no longer a problem. In other words, as generations of Africans were born here on this country, the ability to Christianize them became a lot more simpler to do, simply because they did not have firsthand knowledge of living in Africa. From the end of the American Civil War and Reconstruction in 1877 to the early years of the 20th century, many African-American church houses began to appear in urban and in rural areas throughout the South. At this time in history, African-Americans felt more safe and secure in being able to construct houses of worship, which they owned and maintained. Many of these buildings also served as meeting houses and schools. With the end of the 19th century and the dawn of the first decades of the 20th century, these church houses became the center of life for African-American communities. Many of these churches became sites for political meetings, planning, strategic efforts, as well as spiritual and community safe havens. These church houses became centers to plan and combat segregation as America entered the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. These buildings became what I would argue to be some of the original establishments of safe spaces, or Black spaces, as we now refer to it. The African-American church house is the only building type in the United States created, built, and supported by African-Americans. So moving forward to the influence of the church houses and the modern civil rights movement. Many of these movements and efforts to finally establish a measure of equality in the country in the middle of the 20th century were housed within these buildings. The movement, particularly in the South, exemplified a dichotomy between the effort by some to maintain the vestiges of segregation and traditions of Jim Crow South against others who led and supported the movement towards full and final equality for Negroes in all walks of life, while attempting to ensure that Americans will live up to its creed of a more perfect union for all its citizens. These church houses became more than places to worship. They became centers of education, economics, politics, and communal life, while standing as the first tangible example of constructed material culture by and for African Americans. So from Virginia to Texas, the architecture of the African-American church house has been influenced by local vernacular, both rural and urban, regionalism and architectural styles of the day, meaning the latter part of the 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th century. So such architectural styles as Gothic revival, Greek revival, Romanesque revival were expressed in the construction of these church houses, either through masonry or carpentry construction. Many of these churches have received historic landmark status and are widely revered in mainstream American and African-American life culture, mainly because of what happened in the middle of the 20th century. But from an academic and professional perspective, there's not a lot of information and evidence from an academic perspective that documents the evolution and the socio-cultural influences on the actual architectural design and construction of these buildings. So from my perspective, the story of the African-American religious and cultural life in this country cannot be complete without understanding this component of this first material constructed architecture. So the next number of slides will focus on churches here in Mississippi that were pretty revolutionary, if you will, in their presence. This is Jackson Street Missionary Baptist Church. It was organized in 1888. This building was constructed between 1901 and 1908, and it is one of the best examples of Gothic revival architecture. This is a construction shot back in the 1900s of the church going up. And the only difference here between what you're looking at now and what stands now here in the front is the entry portal of the building. When completed, this building became the largest brick-owned constructed church house in the entire state of Mississippi. Here are some interior shots of the church house. And in my research, what I have collected here are churches that have to meet a certain specific requirement to make it into my research. And one of the big efforts here is that these church houses had to be constructed by African Americans. An architect did not necessarily have to be involved in the design of the structure, but the building had to be constructed by Black people. This
Excuse me, Dr. Hunter.
Yes.
I'm so very sorry to interrupt, but
Yes.
your slides haven't moved. So
I'm
I'm
sorry?
wondering if especially you could put up the slide of the church that you're speaking about now. I know the audience is very interested to see it, but we're still looking at the first slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ask them to go to presentation.
Can you see that?
People are suggesting go to presentation mode. Ah, wonderful.
Can you see that?
Do you know where that is?
He needs to
Yes, we can, but hold on. Someone has a suggestion.
tell them to go to slideshow at the top.
So if you go to the slideshow at the top, Jody,
I can't do it from here.
Oh.
Or can I?
no, but he can hear you.
Okay. Dr. Hunter,
Yes.
at the top of your screen, you should see slideshow. If you click on that.
Okay.
What is it?
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it here.
Or at the front.
Well, if you just click on each slide as you speak from
Okay,
the left, from the
I can
left
do that.
bottom, we'll be able to see it.
Okay,
Sorry not for having alerted you soon.
okay. Do you see this wooden church?
Yes.
Okay, this is New Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Estill, Mississippi, which is in the Mississippi Delta. This church was organized in 1918 and constructed in that same year. This is an example of carpenter Gothic architecture. Much of the research that I have that I've studied here has focused on whether the church either located in an urban environment or a rural environment. Depending upon that environment, the manner of construction and specifically the materials that were used to construct these buildings may have, generally speaking, been made of bricks if it were within an urban environment, and carpentry or wood sticks if it were located in a rural environment like what you're seeing here. So this church sits on the edge of a river in which 100 years ago there was a flood that occurred, and the church was the only structure in the town of Estill that actually survived that flood. And it's, as you can see today, it is in a pretty tough state here as far as its physical condition. Can you see this image of the interior?
If you click on it, we'll see it. Yes.
Okay. This is the interior shot of the church as it stands today. It is on the endangered list here in Mississippi as something that the Heritage Trust here in the state is trying to raise funds for to support. And the problem here is in many of these churches, either the congregation no longer exists or they have abandoned the structure. And that is unfortunate because this is what we have left of the architectural heritage of people that lived within this specific community. Okay, can you guys see?
Yeah,
Can you see the next church, Bethel African AME?
yes, we can.
Okay, this church is in Vicksburg. It was organized in 1864. It is an example of Romanesque revival church, Romanesque revival architecture. This church has history in the fact that it was the first AME church established in the state of Mississippi. Many of these buildings, in this case, this building is located within the urban context of the city of Vicksburg. This church has very distinct architectural features, very strong facade treatment of very large rose window towers, and very high pitched roofs. In many cases, these churches were designed so that either you would enter through the tower itself, or if the facade was more balanced with regards to the location of the entrance of the building, it would be located in the center. This is an interior shot of the church as it stands today. Again, this is a really good, very strong example of Romanesque revivalist architecture. And between Gothic revival architecture and Romanesque revival, these were two very popular styles that existed here in the state of Mississippi. Okay, Holy Family Catholic Church is one of actually quite a few Catholic churches that are located here in the state. This was organized between 1890 and 1893. It is also an example of Gothic revival. This structure was completed in 1894, and it represents the first Catholic church established for African Americans here in the state of Mississippi. There are flat buttresses, which are these vertical elements you see between the windows here, and the windows have pointed arches, or they're referred to as lancet windows. Again, this is a revivalist style that was popular a number of years earlier, but that made it to the Black community as these churches were being constructed. So this is one church that continues to exist today. St. Rosa de Lima Catholic Church is located in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. It is on the coast. It was organized in 1868. This church structure was completed in 1926. There are a number of African-American churches that don't quite fit a very clear context of what type of style it may be. In many cases, a local vernacular might be applicable, which I believe is the case here. But one of the most interesting architectural features within the body of this church is what you see here in the back of the choir box. This is a mural called Christ in the Oaks. And this became one of the first elements here of an Afrocentric cultural influence on the actual design of the church itself. So in many churches at the turn of the century, and even today, these church structures were beginning to take an Afrocentric role here in the idea of what our culture could influence within the context of the architecture. As we go outside the state, this church, the first African Baptist church, became the first church that I studied in my research. This was organized in 1773, and it was constructed between 1855 and 1859. This is what the church looked like in the middle of the 19th century after it was completed. It was a red brick building with no tower at all, and people entered from the front of the building. This mimicked many churches of the time that were constructed in Savannah, Georgia, except this was a fairly humble church where today there is a layer of stucco that reflects the original outline of the church itself.
Dr. Hunter, I'm just going
Yes.
to give one more quick message. It's about time to conclude.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. What I will do then is just move forward here. If you can view these slides of churches that exist throughout Texas and throughout the Southeast. These are examples, different examples of church types that reflect different regions, different forms of vernacular, and different cultural elements here within the architectural stylistic forms of the day. And with this, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. My apologies for the challenges here from the computer, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Imagine I need to share this with folks there as well.
Oh, yes. Good idea.
Hopefully the folks on Zoom have the ability to see that PowerPoint. But again, I just want to thank all of you for being here today. Thanks to Dr. Rosen for moderating the panel and for the invitation to speak here today. This project is really the result of a class that I took at William & Mary, emerged in some ways by accident and exploring a completely different topic. I stumbled across this one. It has become far more than simply just a research project for me. In a class on wealth and inequality with Professor Petty here, I was exploring advertisements, in particular, the turn of the century Richmond, looking specifically at the funeral industry and the industry surrounding death in the African-American community, largely as sort of an exploration of questions of wealth and inequality. And in the process, stumbled upon the sort of observation that it was in looking at the formation of Woodland Cemetery in Richmond. A number of things started to be very obvious, and that was the role of John Mitchell Jr. In its formation and foundation. Much of the advertisements I was looking at were from the Richmond Planet, which was the newspaper that was founded and edited by John Mitchell Jr. So he is, of course, responsible for the advertisements that I was looking at. He was, as you can see in this particular instance here, as demonstrated at the bottom of that Woodland Cemetery Corporation advertisement, the president of the Woodland Cemetery Corporation. On the separate page directly next to the cemetery advertisement was an advertisement for the Mechanic Savings Bank. The Mechanic Savings Bank was headed by its president and founder, John Mitchell Jr. And in the process of looking at some of the content of the advertisement, it spoke to sort of 2 years of effort to secure the land and property, which was led by the Repton Land Corporation. The Repton Land Corporation's president was also John Mitchell Jr. So it was very obvious in the context of looking at this research that it was pretty impossible to sort of understand the history and legacy of Woodland Cemetery without John Mitchell Jr., but also obvious that his connections in the industry surrounding death and burial in Richmond extended far beyond simply just the cemetery. The paper itself provided the space for obituaries, places for families to make lasting remembrances to loved ones. His role as president of the Mechanic Savings Bank not only financed the cemetery's construction and production, but was also influential in the financing of funeral homes and various entrepreneurs in the Richmond area tied to this particular industry. Mitchell was the president and head chancellor of the Virginia Knights of Pythias, Black fraternal organization, which was quite influential in the provision of insurance and services for deaths and funerals of its members. This man was intricately connected to the culture and community surrounding death in the late 19th and early 20th century Richmond. And what was interesting in the process of really exploring Mitchell's role in this context is that much of that context was entirely missing from the legacy and the history and scholarship surrounding Mitchell's activism. He is a very well-known figure. How many of you are familiar with Mitchell? All right. He is a very well-known figure as an early civil rights leader in Richmond. Very well known for being one of a few Black city council members in Richmond. He ran for governor in 1921. He led the Richmond streetcar boycotts, which were quite famous at the time, as sort of examples of early activism. And in much of the public understanding and public memory of Richmond and of Black leaders in the South, Mitchell sort of stands out as a pretty prominent figure in this context. The academic legacy of Mitchell is somewhat different. Certainly, a lot of these things are acknowledged, but much of Mitchell's academic legacy, in particular, fueled by his involvement and investment in the Mechanic Savings Bank, is tied to his business legacy and career. And a lot of the academic scholarship focuses on Mitchell as an accommodationist leader, a member of the uplift generation, certainly, but somebody caught within the sort of politics of respectability and the very difficult and tense class dynamics within the Black community in Richmond. And even the biography of Mitchell, Anfield Alexander's Race Man, Woodland Cemetery has a single sentence as sort of part of that legacy. And so it struck me in the process of this research that the scholarship that exists about Woodland Cemetery as a space and the scholarship that existed about John Mitchell Jr. More broadly were simply just disconnected from each other. And it was the intention and the sort of goal of my project to explore the ways in which Woodland Cemetery and its creation, both as a space, as well as the legacy of Mitchell's actions in promoting, constructing, and really ensuring the sustained legacy of this space were part of that legacy. It's no secret, certainly, and much of the research was really focused on, Mitchell was quite aware of the politics of memory in the late 19th century. Being one of just 3 remaining city council members at the time of the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee Monument statue in Richmond, Mitchell was quite vocal in leading the resistance of those 3 members in refusing to vote for city appropriations for funding for the monument's unveiling. And he was very famously quoted, and very aptly so, that African Americans in Richmond put up the Lee Monument, and should the time come, will be there to take it down. And that is obviously a legacy that certainly proved to be true. But it speaks to, in some ways, the nature of Richmond at this time period. In public attitudes and memory, white Richmonders were constructing monuments to the Lost Cause, monuments to the Confederacy across that space, engaged in deliberate attempts to erase the history of African-American history and the legacy of that community in spaces like Woodland Cemetery, in Mitchell's eyes, as well as in the eyes of those who continue to work for it. We're about trying to recapture and really unsilence those aspects. And so that is really what my research looked at. It is situated largely within the narrative of residential segregation. Much of the impetus behind Woodland's creation is tied, in fact, to another community quite near it, and that is the Barton Heights suburb of Richmond, which at the time, at least in the post-Civil War period, as well as during the Civil War era, the Barton Heights area was the site of a number of African-American cemeteries for the burial of Black residents who predominantly lived in the Jackson Ward region, which is in the sort of downtown central region of that area. Barton Heights, as was true of residential sort of trends in the late 19th and early 20th century, the white flight from suburbs, the movement and creation of white suburbs surrounding urban centers. Barton Heights was sort of one of the premier aspects of this. And you can see in sort of some of the advertising for Barton Heights, the types of imagery and things that were being promoted there. It's sort of ideal residential suburb, sort of away from the dangers of city life, a place where a town of beautiful homes occupied by its owners. A lot of these things were speaking quite specifically to the creation of Barton Heights as a refuge and space away from what had become a very heavily concentrated Black community in the downtown region of Richmond. And Mitchell was quite involved in efforts by Barton Heights officials and resisting those efforts as the editor of the Richmond Planet in promoting and really publicizing the story of the efforts of those white communities to shut down and prevent the burials that were happening in those particular places. And the township of Barton Heights sort of acquired the right from the state of Virginia to regulate the cemeteries in that region, and in the early 20th century did lead a prohibition on those burials. And Mitchell was very much a part of that. One of the editorials that you see there on the right-hand side is Mitchell decrying the actions of those officials, and in particular using the legacy and memory of the treatments of Black folks who had died in Richmond in the process of suggesting what the intentions of these officials really were. And as many people certainly would note, and this sort of will help situate in some ways both where the Jackson Ward region is, Barton Heights, as well as where Woodland is essentially formulated, it became quite clear, at least as a result of a lot of his editorial efforts and the work of those who were involved, that despite the city's concerns that they put on about health, that much of it was really just about the nature and presence, and in particular, types of Black rituals for funerals, long processions that moved through city streets, and really the ongoing efforts of white officials to prevent those things from going on that led Mitchell to create Woodlands. I mentioned that advertisement before, which really struck me as I was first looking at it. It really speaks to, in some ways, all of the things that I think are central to the research that I did. The first of which being this sort of phrase that's listed in that second paragraph, the idea that the location was secured about 2 years of effort and is situated in a neighborhood where the progressive colored people can rest assured that they will not be disturbed. And really speaking to the actions and efforts that he took in the Barton Heights region to make sure that that was the case. Woodland was constructed as, in many ways, a counter-memory scape. The roads themselves were named after prominent Black Americans. You have Douglas Circle, Langston Road, Washington Circle, Jasper Road, named after John Jasper, the famous Reverend of Richmond. This space is intentionally designed in a way, again, to bring the public memory and Black history center to what was just being talked about in some ways, a specifically Black space. It was also constructed, as many of the post-emancipation Black cemeteries throughout the South was, in the vein of the rural cemetery movement, a movement in the early antebellum periods where the first cemeteries really served as public parks. Spaces of refuge, spaces of leisure, spaces where communities could come together, not just to honor the dead, but also to engage in leisure and pastimes. And it is not coincidental, certainly in a period of intense segregation, where Black Americans were restricted from access to public parks, that spaces like cemeteries and Black cemeteries formed in this period would fulfill that role. Mitchell understood that well. Woodland Park was adjacent directly to Woodland and was designed really for those types of purposes, providing access to leisure space at a time where they lacked that access. This is the earliest photo, at least existing and known surviving photo. It's actually aerial footage of Woodland Cemetery. You can sort of see the designs that were on those original plans, but also the creeping in of the environment and sort of taking back and reclaiming some of that space, and that becomes definitely central to its legacy later. I wish I had more time to talk about some of the individuals in particular, but I think that's certainly true of cemeteries and great about these spaces, that they are really monuments and legacies to the people that are there, and through headstones, through monuments, through the elaborate things that were created there, we really get a sense for fraternal community and family. That is sort of a lasting legacy written into stone, the relationships, communities, as well as roles that Black Americans served in this time period. Thomas Crump's memorial is probably the most prominent, one of the most prominent on the landscape. He was Mitchell's best friend, but it sort of specifies all of the things that he did over the course of his life. And again, sort of creating that lasting legacy and memory that Black Americans were members of the press, they were bank leaders, they were involved in insurance companies, they were prominent members of the community, doctors, lawyers, and all of that sort of commemorated in stone, as well as people. Just the elaborate porcelain display of Hattie Jefferson demonstrates sort of the commitment to that. And if you look really across that, you see the sort of communities claiming that space in this way. Beneficial clubs, fraternal organizations, really, you can see with George Burnett in particular, that there weren't just single headstones, but multiple headstones. Everybody wanted to ensure, and again, sort of put down the claim to the memory and ensure that lasting memory, not just of their involvement in their organizations, but the types of commitments they made to their community, as well as to family. And so that's, I think, one of the sort of legacies and important aspects of the physical spaces of cemeteries. They give us a sense for what people did, and also give us a sense for what mattered to people as to what was to be remembered and what was important about being remembered. We also get a little bit, there are very few surviving files from the time of Mitchell's creation of the cemetery, just a few lot certificates that remain. But that advertisement that I mentioned before also speaks to, in some ways, the importance of cemeteries as unconventional property ownership opportunities, that people were deeded a lot to their cemetery plots, that they possessed this as a means of securing and demonstrating ownership of property, and also opportunities for advancement, opportunities for leadership in the community. As you can see here, the cemetery was run by lot owners. You purchased a lot, you would have an opportunity to vote in the affairs of the cemetery corporation with a board of directors that was headed by an officer group similar to the opportunities that were provided by Black churches and fraternal organizations. Cemeteries like Woodland also offered these same opportunities in a time period, again, where people like Mitchell are being removed from city council officials or city council appointments and political positions as a result of gerrymandering, certainly the political time period. It does not mean that questions of respectability and questions of access are not present. They certainly are. The purchasing of a lot was not cheap, and the costs escalated over time. There are definitely elements about the nature of respectability that exist and that are present there. We can see this in particular of the reinterments that happened when Woodland opened, where prominent members of the community moved or reinterred from the cemeteries in Barton Heights and other places into Woodland Cemetery. The costs of that were certainly astronomical. We have the monument company books to know how much John Jasper's monument removal was. It was more than $400, including $60 for the reinterment body itself. So it is not something that everybody has the ability to access. And in the lasting monuments, we also see sort of the challenges of sustaining these types of legacy. The Dr. Jones monuments to his wife, as well as his mother, is one of the most prominent and beautiful on the landscape, an exceptionally costly monument as well. But his headstone, in stark contrast with that, speaks to the challenges of Black communities in really maintaining these spaces of entrepreneurship, and really, as Richmond was often called, the Jackson Ward, sort of the Black Wall Street, being able to maintain sources of wealth. And so Really, the last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is my involvement in the process of reclamation. This is true of a number of cemeteries across the country. The focus sort of on trying to recover and restore Black cemeteries and really illustrate their importance. These are some before and after images of Woodlands restoration, which began in earnest really in the last 5 years or so. It was repurchased by an individual, Marvin Harris, in 2020, different from some of the other Black cemeteries in Richmond that are controlled by the Richmond Foundation, which is an entire topic itself that could certainly be talked about if you know that politics. But the efforts of individuals really to reclaim this space is something that I have very much been very honored to be a part of. I started as a weekend volunteer, clearing brush and such. My ability to operate a zero-turn mower led very quickly to me becoming a weekly person there, particularly now. And we had to start early because spring definitely came early and the weeds came back very quickly. But they are also in the process of engaged in a capital investment campaign to restore the chapel, which is the only remaining building on the site. As a education center and museum. And so I've been working with them both to provide some of that historical context, but also in some of the grant work. We're applying right now for a National Park Service preservation grant through the Civil Rights Grant Program. And they have engaged and are really invested in trying to return this space. And I look forward to being able to continue to do that as well. So I'm really interested and really love being able to kind of help with the recovery of graves and sites there. And it's not really just an effort towards cleanup, but also a concern for memories. Mitchell said he wanted to be sure that he was afraid, really, that the legacy of African Americans would not be remembered. And there is really nothing better, I think, than Woodland Cemetery and its space to demonstrate how they are, in fact, remembered.
I just want to say that we are, because of various technical things, we are running a little bit over time. And although the overall organizers may scold me for this, I would just like to invite everyone to stay after our 2:45 time to make sure we have time for discussion. There's another session in here at 3, so we'll have to be out by 5 minutes.
Lydia, are you trying to
Share the screen, yeah. I think, yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, great. All right, I'm going to try to maybe get this done a little quicker than I had originally planned. I just want to thank everybody for coming today and thank the Women Project organizers for having me. I feel really honored to be a part of this great panel. Gosh, heard some really great stuff. But my name is Lydia Neuroth. I am the project manager for the Virginia Untold project at the Library of Virginia. And I am going to be talking a little bit about outreach initiatives and opportunities using this project today. So just to recap, I'm from LVA in downtown Richmond. If you guys haven't visited us, please come and check out some of our resources. Our URL is there on the screen. We have a lot of digital resources, things online as well. One of which is the Virginia Untold project. I'm actually going to just put this up here. Okay, there we go. Hopefully, many of you in the room are familiar with this project or have at least heard about it. Virginia Untold is the library's digital project that facilitates access to records around enslaved and free people of color in our collections pre-1867. I do not have time to get into the project history or the website today, but it is on the screen there. I definitely encourage you to check it out if you are doing research in this area. We have a number of records digitized, actually over 18,000 at this point that are available online for viewing. from various Virginia localities. The project really predates me. I've only been here since May of 2021, but it's been around for many years. Most recently, we received a National Archives grant to hire a project manager, my position that focuses on two aspects of the work, digitizing our free Negro registers and records around Richmond City from the 1780s up to the Civil War. However, there's a big part of this grant that I really want to carry forward, which is the outreach and engagement piece, which I do recognize has come to be sort of this like easy word to throw around. But it's something that I really want to think about moving forward, especially because now we've realized that we have funding to carry this project into the future indefinitely, because we'll be state funded. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Selma's laughing because she's on the screen. I do love this photo, and I think it speaks to something that I think we have done pretty well with Virginia Untold and at the Library of Virginia. Since the beginning, we have started crowdsourced transcribing many of the documents that are available in Virginia Untold. So if you go to access an online image, you'll also typically find the transcription with that. We started our Making History Transcribed project in 2014, just a year after Virginia Untold started. And we've gained a lot of support from the public, from volunteers that just sign up to help us. And we have moved from sort of a setup to kind of throwing stuff online and letting people do it, to hosting these transcribe-a-thons where we ask people to come. We explain a little bit about the record that we're going to be transcribing that day, have a period where we're all transcribing together, and then setting aside some time for reflection. And I really appreciated that because it's finally an opportunity to hear from people that are looking at the documents. And I think that's something we miss as archivists and librarians, is that we approach the documents with a very particular type of perspective. And we lose the research perspective, the genealogy perspective, the academic perspective. And so that gives us just a little bit of a window into what people are experiencing when they're looking at this material, whether it's just barriers with the handwriting or if it's actual content that is difficult to wade through. These are heavy documents that are filled with, as we all know, trauma and grief. Something else I think we've done pretty well is sharing about the project through our blog, the Uncommonwealth blog, which used to go by a different name. I would definitely encourage you all to check this out, because in addition to posting about Virginia Untold, the library also shares about various updates and different resources and things that we're finding in the library's collections. The title of this particular blog, we actually shared on social media as well. Interestingly enough, it got a lot of kind of heated feedback on Facebook. Facebook is a breeding ground for lots of opinions, is what we've realized. And I just share that to say that I think sometimes we dismiss social media as a place or a space for engagement. But what we're finding is that people are kind of ready to have those conversations in a social space. They are not always the sort of well-constructed, sort of positive, uplifting conversations, but they are a form of engagement with our users. So it's just something that I've noticed since I've been working here specifically, that people are reading this stuff and they are talking. I mean, this particular conversation that ensued was whether this story was accurate or not. And we are posting from the records, we're writing things from the records, and people were arguing about whether we were making it up. So just really an interesting sort of dialogue that's happening, even when we are not kind of facilitating or controlling it. But what I really want to focus on in my remaining minutes is working with some classrooms. So I just want to caveat this by saying that I am not an educator. I'm not even a library instruction sort of specialist. I'm not even really an outreach archivist, but I have found that students are really engaged and interested in this material, and it's something I really wanted to talk about with this work. So for the last 2 years, I have been invited to a high school in Chesterfield County, Matoaka High School, to talk about Virginia Untold. I was not really given a curriculum, what they were learning about, a curriculum, standards. I was just invited to talk about the project. So I set it up basically with introducing the project. Who am I? how did I get into the role? What does Virginia Untold basically do? Maybe helping students recognize that this is a career path possible for them if they're interested. But then I focused most of my time on actually introducing documents that we as archivists or we as researchers interact with all the time. So I organized a primary source activity where I shared printed out copies of an original image of the documents from Virginia Untold. I worked with Deeds of Emancipation, thinking that that was fairly straightforward, something we could sort of work through as a group, and essentially ask students to just look at the image and try to make sense of it. I did not give them the transcription. I wanted them to spend 5 minutes with the original image, approaching it the same way that we have to, right? We don't get the cheat sheet when we start out. And then I asked them, after giving them the transcription, to work through a series of questions, essentially critical analysis questions that we are all asking ourselves when we approach primary sources, whether explicitly or implicitly all the time. Students had the transcription at this point. They got to spend more like 10 minutes in groups now puzzling through the questions on the document and making sense of the original image with the transcription. What did they get right? Were they able to make out names or dates? Could I help them kind of pull out those search terms that I would want them to use later on in the database when they're doing searching? And then, of course, what is the document? Where is it from? What is missing from the item? Students really went pretty far with this question, realizing that there was a lot they didn't know. I had a bonus question on there of, why do you think this ended up in an archive? Why was it preserved? So I wanted them to sort of like puzzle through those things as a group. They did really great with that. We came back together, discussed it, talked a little bit about what the record was, tried to make sense of it, even the laws around it. And then we shifted into the second part of the exercise of asking them to go into the Virginia Untold database. So with the answers they had from their primary source analysis worksheet, could they now go into Virginia Untold, find the person that they were looking at on the sheet, and then maybe find more information about that individual from using certain search terms? This I found was a little more challenging for the students. Trying to narrow their search. They could definitely locate their original document in the database. They typically couldn't get a whole lot farther than that. It's honestly a whole separate exercise. It's a whole separate lesson I could have done. In the 2 years, I did have a difference in time. So the first year I came, I actually had 1 hour and 15 minutes, I believe, versus the second year, I had 45 minutes. I actually found that students sort of tired out after 50 minutes. That was like the mark. They glazed over, they were not engaged. So it actually worked better to have a smaller amount of time and just try to capture their interest in that sort of time frame. I also introduced bills of sale in the second year. So instead of just looking at deeds of emancipation, could some groups look at bills of sale, which are a different document, right? Enslaved people are now being transferred as property rather than being freed. Could students make sense of the fact that different things are happening here, different fates are now resulting based on this document and the choice of someone else? In both scenarios, though, I asked students to fill out an exit ticket. And I would really encourage if you're working with any sort of audience, to just ask for their feedback, because I found that students were ready to tell me what they struggled with, what their favorite part was, and also what they wanted to know more about. So those were the 3 questions I asked them. Hopefully y'all can read this. This particular answer at the bottom I thought was really fascinating. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Just that students are already introduced to these sorts of hard topics. This is not new stuff to them. They're talking about it already, whether it's in the classroom or outside of the classroom. But in large part, I found that students really enjoyed the puzzling through the old handwriting, making sense of what the document was. They liked the challenge of it, and then comparing it with the transcription. The discovery aspect of going into the database, trying to tease out more information, that was rewarding to them. But the same things that they liked were also challenging. Reading the old handwriting, trying to make sense of what is this document, who wrote this document, what is going on. The language is different, and it's not how we talk today. And then the searching online piece, like I said, trying to scope their search was definitely a challenge. It's a challenge for many people, actually. Definitely interested in the what's missing, what else, who are these individuals, where did they go? That's weird. That was sudden. Okay, I'm going to keep talking. These next two slides, I don't have a lot of narrative. I'm just going to let you all read. These examples are from the first year that I went into the classroom. So again, just certainly getting at some of the things I just mentioned on the previous slide. Another example here. The cursive definitely alive, I think. Individual's handwriting probably needs some transcription, so. I love that they called it gibberish too. Okay, and this was from 2023. So again, students were challenged by this, but they wanted to do it. They were tenacious, they kept at it. I really appreciated the students that were interested in the process piece. So the student that was like, do they use a scanner? Is it just all brains? How are they doing this? You know, the process is interesting to them of kind of the behind the scenes, the access piece. Did you see the question about how do I get more access to the archives? As a librarian, I couldn't ask for anything else. Let me tell you, grasping the concept, there was definitely, especially when I was coming around to the student groups and talking with them, there was talk of, these were real people. There was definitely the concept that Letty went somewhere after she was emancipated. She ended up in Petersburg, and we find her in a tax record. There is certainly a very clear understanding that these were real people documented in these records, and we need to make sense of who they are. It made me think, though, are these students ready for something even more advanced? I felt like deeds of emancipation were really clear cut, they were straightforward, but the conversations we were having, their level of engagement made me wonder, could I move on to something like a petition to remain, where formerly emancipated people are required to petition the state to stay in Virginia? Could we talk about the laws behind that? Could we make sense of, you know, there is a explicit desire to get Black people out of the state of Virginia? I feel like they're ready for that conversation. So just some stuff I'm thinking about for moving forward. And then I just have to end with this final exit ticket, because I just really appreciated the honesty in the students' response. And I think it's honestly just really grounding. It's very humbling, right? Sometimes the best part of our day is lunch. It's going to the bathroom. It's not, this is heavy stuff. We have to realize that when we're talking to all people. No, I don't want to learn anything else. I just want to go home, right? So I just have to end with that and just like a light note for us. And thank you guys so much for listening and the part of the day.
So my one job today was to keep us on time, and I've done a terrible job. So we are already past time. But please, they're not knocking on the doors yet. I hope somebody has some thoughts to share or some questions for the panelists. In the very back of the room there, you're first, and then in the corner over here, you're second, okay?
Our history of Lynchburg, about over the church, about the doctrine, the architects, and all about our churches. Most of our churches were wood, and a lot of them was wood. And with Oak Grove, before we made the historical part, we actually got the race ceiling and the veil and the windows that have the pulley on them right now at the church. That's what made our historical very easy, because the way they came and looked at the time period and era, the different eras. So with that said, when he was talking about the architect, our problem is now with the historic church, the windows are, they can't be repaired. But it's historical, because they got the pulleys and all of that in them, and they got the cover stand, but now we're trying to figure out what to do with them. How do we get the shape, how we keep the shape of it? Because they was such a part of moving from one place to another. So we're trying to figure out how to preserve that history, because the one thing about Old Grove Baptist Church, they kept a lot of their history, no matter where they traveled to. They kept it, they didn't discard it, they put it in the church. And that's why that little church right now is still, they got a room inside, but they don't have bricks yet. And, it still had the beaded wood, still have all of that stuff. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do we preserve that?
Dr. Hunter, I don't know if you were able to hear any of that.
I heard bits and pieces. I wasn't able to hear all of it.
Okay, it's a question about preserving especially the windows in the historic church, which can't be repaired. Many details are not possible to be made now. And an audience member is struggling with what they can do to try to preserve the old windows of a historic black church.
Okay. Excuse me. Yeah, that and so many other parts, physical parts of those buildings can be a challenge because of primarily the manner in which the window and maybe the frame was constructed. Part of preservation efforts here is to try to replicate as best as possible the architectural element that you're trying to replace. In this case, the stained glass window. So there are ways of being able to do it. In many cases, it may cost a little bit of money to do it, simply because of the unique nature and the manner of construction. And if it were a unique design, a specific stained glass design, then the replication of it may be even more of a challenge. I think that's in the bigger picture, the challenge of many of these churches, in the fact that it is going to cost a great deal to restore or renovate many of these structures, which in a number of cases have never had any renovation work done on them at all. So there are a number of components here that will be a challenge from a constructability standpoint in the attempt to replicate an architectural element that was built in the 19th century or even the early part of the 20th century.
Thank you.